Hello. I'm very glad to speak with you, and I hope that I can be of service to your class and your students. Sure. I was born in London in 1920 to Jewish parents. My parents were very wealthy through banking and publishing. My parents cared about education and philanthropy and social causes. They wanted the best education for me, and they were just fine citizens of London. I was a very curious child. I loved memory games and puzzles. My aunt once remarked that I was alarmingly clever. I spent my time doing arithmetic for pleasure, which some people thought somewhat odd, but I didn't really look up from my work to notice, I suppose. I went to St. Paul's Girls' School. St. Paul's has a strong tradition of preparing women for careers. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was pretty unusual back then to encourage girls to go into the work field. I thrived in school. I loved science, math, hockey, cricket, lacrosse, and I was the best at almost everything that I tried in school. I graduated early from St. Paul's and got a scholarship to go to Cambridge University to study physics and chemistry. My parents were somewhat disappointed because they had hoped that I would go into the family business, which was a philanthropic organization. But I told my parents I couldn't imagine that I would be of any use to anything except science, and I just couldn't see myself doing anything else. Ah, the Nazis. Yeah, they were marching during my childhood, and I wanted to do something to help. So many people talk about what the government should do and what other people should do to help, but the Franklins really believed in getting involved, so we helped find safe havens for refugees in England. The whole country was preparing for invasion during my time at Cambridge. Helping the war effort was a top priority. I created a more efficient and safer gas mask that was used by British soldiers. In 1938, I went to the Women's College at Cambridge University. I learned about a new technique called X-ray crystallography. Because atoms are too small to see with a light microscope, I was able to shoot X-rays at them and then they would bounce back onto a film. And by applying math to the diffraction pattern, I was able to calculate the three-dimensional molecule that I was observing and see what its structure looked like. I became an expert in this field, and it opened up a whole new world of things too small for other scientists to see. Ah, yes. Oh, after the war was over, I was offered a research position at the most well-respected lab in Paris, and it was my dream job. I loved everything about Paris, the food, the people, the architecture, walking along the Seine, the fashion, the markets. It was here that I perfected my technique at X-ray crystallography, and I started to gain a professional reputation, speaking at conferences and publishing in professional journals. Well, I reluctantly decided to leave Paris when I was offered a highly prestigious position at King's College in London. I was hired by J.T. Randall to create an X-ray crystallography unit to investigate the structure of proteins. At the time, scientists really believed that proteins were um, important, that they were the genetic material. They held the key to life. But slowly but surely through the 1940s, um, it was determined that DNA might have a larger impact based on some studies that were done. So I eventually started studying DNA. Yeah, so scientists thought that proteins were more complex, and so they thought that the proteins were what held the DNA or the genetic material, the heredity material, because they were so complex. And the structure of DNA is so simple. It's only 6 molecules. It's sugar and phosphate, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. They thought it's impossible that such a simple structure could carry the secret of life. But once it was suggested that DNA carried the secret of life, there became a great race among scientists to uncover the structure of DNA, and I was part of that race at King's College. Well, you have to understand that in the 1950s, women were certainly not welcomed into the scientific community. We were only 22 years past giving the women the right to vote, and women were still expected to make motherhood and wifedom their top priorities. It was very strange to see a woman in the lab, and if they were found, if a skillful scientist that was a woman and she was found in the lab, she was assumed to be an assistant. So besides that, when I was hired at King's College, Dr. Randall informed me that I would be the only one working in the lab and that I would have my own assistants. Dr. Maurice Wilkins was on leave at the time. He was on vacation at the time, and so I got to work in the lab and made it very efficient and successful. And then when Dr. Wilkins came back, he made the assumption that I was his assistant, and I didn't want to be bossed, and he didn't like being told to back off by me. And so there was a tense relationship between the two of us. It was difficult to work there, and I was pretty unhappy there. I was better trained and had more experience than Dr. Wilkins at X-ray crystallography, and so I didn't appreciate him sticking his nose in my business. The male scientists that were at King's College really worked like a boys' club. I wasn't allowed in the lunchroom because I was a woman. They only had a men's bathroom at the laboratory. And so there really was a culture that was not welcoming of female scientists. And so I became very focused on my work. I loved the work, and so it made it worth it to be there. But I really kind of stuck to myself. I was isolated and alienated from the other scientists in my community. Dr. Watson and Dr. Wilkins were so arrogant they didn't want my advice or my corrections, regardless of if they were correct, just because I was a woman. It was quite absurd, actually. But I didn't need a babysitter or any new friends. I did just fine on my own, so I just made sure that I did my work to the best of my ability, focused on that, and asked Dr. Wilkins to give me my space. Right, well, I was quite determined and focused in the lab, working constantly to take x-rays of DNA. At this time, Dr. Watson, who I mentioned earlier, he was a new, young American scientist who'd come over and wanted to work at King's College, where I was working. But Dr. Wilkins didn't take the bait, and he did not ask Watson to join us. So Watson ended up at Cambridge, and he was also studying the gene. He and another scientist, Francis Crick, really got on well, and they started to work on the structure of DNA. They used one of Maurice Wilkins' early images of X-ray crystallography of the DNA molecule. They invited us to come and view their model. They had made a model of DNA, and I recognized right off that it was wrong. They had a triple helix, and they had the nitrogen bases on the outside like leaves on a tree. I pointed out their mistakes, and I suppose that hurt their feelings a bit. Maybe they were embarrassed at their public failure. Apparently, Dr. Watson had some pretty childish tendencies, as he took my corrections very personally, though they weren't intended as such. We never quite clicked after that, socially, after that incident, and he started calling me Rosie and the Dark Lady in kind of a condescending manner. It was quite annoying, really. Not long after that, Watson and Crick were told that they weren't allowed to make models anymore by their boss. It wasn't of my doing, but they were embarrassed, apparently, of the public failure, and so they were told not to work on models anymore. Well, around that time, my unpublished notes and findings and images were being taken from my personal laboratory. I didn't realize it at the time, but they were being taken to Watson and Crick, who were using my work to make corrections on their models. I suspect that Dr. Wilkins was the one to take my notes and my things, but he says he doesn't remember if he was the one who gave my unpublished findings to Dr. Watson and Dr. Crick. As they met over my stolen notes, they also gossiped like schoolgirls about how terrible and difficult the Dark Lady was. It was really quite childish. I was becoming more and more miserable in this tense environment at work, and I started to make plans to leave King's College. There just wasn't a commitment to collaboration and support that I had experienced in the lab in Paris. James Watson actually came to the lab once and argued that if I didn't share my work readily, another scientist, Peter Pauling, would beat us to the finish to figure out the structure of DNA. He insisted that I help him and said that it was my duty to do so. I quite disagreed, and he became irate, shouting and becoming aggressive. My picture showed them that the sugars and phosphates swirl in opposite directions against each other in an anti-parallel double helix. I had told them that the bases were in the middle when I corrected their model originally. With Erwin Chargaff's findings about nitrogen bases, they were also able to deduce that the bases were the connecting molecules. And with William Asbury's work, they figured that the bases stacked in the middle like pennies. At first, Watson believed that the bases paired with like bases, so adenine with adenine and thymine with thymine, and it wasn't until one of his lab assistants, Jerry Donahue, showed him that he was using the wrong chemical form that he was able to fit the bases into the framework created by me and my notes. And he figured that adenine went with thymine and cytosine went with guanine. They made a new model, and they needed me to come check it, so I did, and I recognized that the work was correct immediately. Watson seemed surprised that I didn't have any corrections or notes to give, but the model was correct, so I didn't have anything to add. What I didn't know was that how much of my data had been used and needed in order for them to build that correct model. I had no idea that my work had been stolen. Wilkins had shown them my Photo 51 image, the clearest image of DNA. Watson and Crick then published the structure of DNA, while my work was listed as kind of a secondary source. It was third behind Watson and Crick's study, and then Maurice Wilkins' study, and then my own. It implied that my work was an afterthought, that it was a study that confirmed their own work rather than work that preceded theirs. With my notes and images, they were able to make the necessary corrections and publish the correct structure of DNA. Yes, well, I just didn't realize that I was an unknowing and unrecognized collaborator of theirs, all while they were making my work and life miserable in the lab. All three scientists earned the Nobel Prize for their great accomplishments in DNA work. Yes, they did warn me that I had reached dangerous levels of X-ray exposure, but the work was just too important. I didn't know how to not do science. Science was everything. It was very frustrating to be outside the lab. Of course. Goodbye and good luck.